Thank you so much, Shubhish, as Dean. But let me first acknowledge the presence of the guest of honor, Vinita Sethi. In absentia, one of the co-founders, Parth Shah, who it's been my privilege also to know for many years, Luis Miranda, who we are meeting again for a long time, and Dr. Pranab Sen, who I've known and indeed in some ways we've followed each other in various capacities, Statistical Commission, International Growth Center, etc. But most of all, you brave students and even braver parents, it is a privilege for me to be here. I did have prepared remarks, but many of the points that Shubhishish made with his characteristic, if you like, informality and wit have stimulated other thoughts in me. But before I go any further, let me just ask, in the students, is there anybody who has been a NITI Aayog intern at any point? Okay, so I'm glad that that stimulated you to come to this program. In the US, when you have convocation speakers, they think they should be given 30 to 40 minutes, and I'm going to be much more modest. And what I'm going to talk about is, and building on really some of the comments that your dean has raised, rightly so, a little bit about my own story, and linking it up, as he indicated, with the fact that my own background was actually as a public policy graduate student. Then talk a little bit about what one means by being a policy professional based on my experience and, as it were, the education and training I've had. He's mentioned some of the challenges that face India. I want to draw some kind of a link between policy and transformation, because my institution is called the National Institution for Transforming India, and India will be transformed not by me, but by you. And so, therefore, to indicate what it means to transform the most populous nation on earth at this particular moment, demographic, technological, ecological, I'd just like to spend a few words on that. And then, what you should aspire to contribute and how you should aspire to contribute, because I think that is dynamic as well. And I hope I can remain within the time, but since Parth was not here, perhaps I can be allowed a few extra minutes. So, I mean, Shubhishish has given you the, the outline, but essentially there was a very, if you like, practical reason that I went to the Woodrow Wilson School after my undergraduate work in Britain, which was the Woodrow Wilson School at that time. It's no longer called that, by the way, because America has become woke, and Woodrow Wilson is now identified as a slave owner, and so, the school is just called the School of a bit like yourselves, the School of Public and International Affairs, no longer the Woodrow Wilson School, but those of us of a certain vintage call ourselves Woody Woos, and we will continue to do so. I went there because this was the late 1960s, and the US, which goes through these 40-year cycles, was in the afterglow of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And what John Kennedy had famously asked was, ask not what your country, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And that was a moment which is now returning in the US, when there was a belief that government or policy could provide solutions rather than, as it were, the revolution that took place under Thatcher and Reagan, which was that the government was the problem and the main role of the government was to get out of the way. That's not been part of the Indian intellectual tradition. I'm talking now about the US. But in that moment, the Woodrow Wilson School was given a handsome endowment, And so once I was admitted, all my expenses were taken care of. The reason I'm sharing all of this with you is because it links up with a point I wanted to make later. So at that time, the view was very much that to go into public service is either to go into one of the international organizations, as I did, or to go into the civil service. And that is, in a sense, that was also the view in the US, if you like, in the late 60s, early 70s. I joined, as it happened, the World Bank through the Young Professionals Program, straight out of Princeton. 50 years later, the people who endowed the Woodrow Wilson School sued the Woodrow Wilson School on the grounds that many of their alums were going into corporations, government affairs, and that this was not actually consistent with the purposes of the endowment. Now, the US is a litigious society, and so this shouldn't surprise you. The point I want to make is that today, for you as a group, I think is an obsolete point of view. I was looking at the range of recruiters who come to campus. Many of them are from the private sector. Some of them may be interested in CSR, but others are interested in, as it were, engaging with government. So I am pleased that the ethos of the ISPP is to say that you can contribute through a multiplicity of roles. And indeed, the way, as Shubhashi said, all of us were, or many people were trained that, you left St. Stephen's, you did the civil service exams or did a PhD, and the IAS was the acme of aspiration. That world is gone, and I think it's appropriately so. So that's a little bit about my story and the Woodrow Wilson story, but I also wanted now to come to policy and what one means by a policy perspective, very much in the spirit that your dean articulated in his remarks. There is a literature on the policy process. I was exposed to that when NCAR was competing for something called the Think Tank Initiative, and we were fortunate to get a fairly handsome grant from a range of US foundations. And so I did a little bit of reading of what it means to be a think tank and also what it means to engage in the policy process. And it's not a very rich literature, but the US has a number of think tanks, and the articulation that has stayed with me, and the field may have moved on since then, was that governments take decisions finally only in response to political pressure. It's not the case that, technical work done either by a ministry or by a consulting firm or by a think tank is the driver of change. But this large ecosystem exists to anticipate issues, climate change obviously being one, but more importantly, to narrow the space of rational policy making. And I do remember somebody from Pakistan once saying to me that he admired India as a country where there was this vigorous debate, which then shaped the madness of what governments could get up to. And what I would say is that process is continues to work reasonably well at the union level, but I'm not so sure I could say that also about the level of the Indian states. And so a pitch I want to make to you as the vice chairman of NITI Aayog is it may be less glamorous, but in terms of impact, you may well find that you have much more impact if you are able to engage at the level of states. And indeed, it's been a surprise to me, not always a welcome surprise, how much the states themselves are now beginning to depend on consulting firms and others, in addition to NITI Aayog, to think this through. My boss, the Honorable Prime Minister, his sort of slogan or pithy formulation on this is India grows when states grow. And these challenges of employment, climate change, all of these are not challenges for an abstraction called the Indian Union. These are challenges at the level of individual states. And so all I would say is that, the glamour order is at the national level, but the impact order is at the level of states. And the kind of impact you could have if you had the year of the chief minister of a medium-level state would probably exceed any impact that you would have, working with the line ministry here. So that's just a plug for you also to be enlisted in, as it were, the main the main arena of activity of NITI Aayog. But I do want to add my own perception to what your dean had to say, which is that a basis in theory is very important, because that is what gives you a sense of the true north. And so keeping up your awareness in your field, it doesn't have to be economics, it could be, it could be engineering or whatever, but I would say that pure empiricism without some sense of the theoretical background can be dangerous, and that is what politicians will get up to. And it is our role, your role as trained public policy professionals, to be aware not only of the empirical literature, but also of the theoretical literature in your field, so you can deploy that as at least policy advisors. What do I happened in this role to revisit Princeton in April and to engage with the dean there, a lady by the name of Amane Jamal. But I also engaged with the president of Princeton, because even before the prime minister's visit to the US in June, there was a buzz about India on US campuses, and there were various initiatives on education that had already begun to happen. And what I said to both the dean and to the president was absolutely what your dean has said. And I have to admit that the World Bank training was important in this as well, that the difference between being an academic and being a public policy practitioner, it seems to me, is that in academia you are working in an established field and trying to take the frontier forward. As a public policy professional, you have to define a problem and then decide what dimension of your training allows you to decompose the problem into analysis and also, very importantly, distributional. One of the things I'm proud of is in my early years at NCAR, I launched a publication which celebrated its 20th year called the India Policy Forum. And I remember, and this is relevant even today, a comment when the first volume was launched, when somebody made the point, I forget who it was, that look, actually before liberalization in 91, there wasn't a lot you could say about policy, because policy ultimately is about designing incentives so that the private sector goes in the direction that you want. But if resource allocation is completely within the province of the state, which was a little bit the ideology, I would say, with qualifications, because there's always been a vibrant private sector in India, then you are talking about schemes and evaluating schemes. I think what we're talking about in the India of today and tomorrow is for a lot of the heavy lifting to be done by the private sector, and government as articulating incentives and signals for the private sector to follow. Finally, because I've exceeded my time, let me just talk about the relationship between policy, strategy, and vision. So, as some of you would know, many of you would know, from the ramparts of the Red Fort last August, the Prime Minister challenged India to aim to be a developed society, Viksit Bharat, by 2047. Now, this is actually beyond policy. As I said, this is about transformation. The point I wanted to make is that much policy analysis is, at least in economics, is about incremental change. And so I think one of the challenges we all have is how to think about the very long term, how to deal with shocks and uncertainty, how to think about resilience at the level of the individual unit, if some of you end up working in corporations, and the level of the nation as a whole. So let me just end by complimenting all those who've, in such a short time, created this vibrant institution. It's always an honor and an obligation and a privilege for me to interact with India's young, because they are the ones who have to take the baton forward. Shubhishish, I'm glad to discharge any ceremonial duties that you want of me. Thank you so much for the opportunity.